So thank you so much for this opportunity, Ankur Barwa. You actually provided a wonderful and then substantial background to whatever we are going to do for the rest of the colloquium. And also, I really appreciate these ideas about diversity and also the need for an interconnected conversation between among different disciplines. Pranav Bhai, I actually know him for a long time friend since our first meeting at the Sufi Center at Aurangabad, and then we've been in touch since then. I really admire your work, Pranav Bhai. I really appreciate all the beautiful evidence you are bringing into current scholarship. And then Hina Mubarak on your PhD defense. I look forward to read your work, and thank you so much for like responding to my emails. And then I'm a little confused about time zones, and then you made things very much clear. And then I'm so happy to see you here. And then this topic is so close to my heart. And after finishing my previous book, Remaking History, 1948, Police Action and the Muslims of Hyderabad, published by Cambridge University last year, which was a kind of a laborious work for more than 10 years. And then after finishing that, I thought I should do something more relaxing and then less complicated. And then rather than dealing with my like extremely uh, complicated mindscape, I wanted to enter into my heart and do something that is connected to my heart. So this topic, Sufi poetry, not Sufi poetry itself, but I am also going to talk about prose pieces as well. So I would say Sufi writings. But as Ankur explained in his introductory comments, introduction, I also feel there is a strong need to understand what is happening beyond Arabic, Persian, and even Urdu, and then see how vernacular contributes to our understanding of Islam in general and Hindu-Muslim dialogue in specific. So, of course, every project has its own difficulties, considering the heated debates over the Muslim question and the post-colonial approaches to the Muslim being and belonging, which I was struggling with in my previous book. Sufism relatively is somewhat soothing to my mind and body, as if I found a proper posture of yoga. The story begins somewhere in the Telugu-Urdu speaking state of Telangana in South India. Here I emphasize two languages, Telugu and Urdu, because it is like in mainstream historiography, when it comes to Telugu literary histories or cultural histories, we often end up with just speaking about Telugu language and its cultures. We totally ignore what is happening in the case of Deccani Urdu and then Telugu and Deccani Urdu interactions. So, so I'm going to contest some of those language issues as well in my talk today. And then I am going to talk a little bit about how this idea of multilingual local works. And then within this, I want to give a sense of Muslim past. Like in the case of Hyderabad, even coastal Andhra and the other parts of Andhra, bordering with Karnataka, we see huge influence of Persianate cultures of the Golconda Sultanate, also known as Qutub Shahi dynasty. And then even now, Uncle was talking about my previous book, the Festival of Pirs, which is a local term for Muharram. So most Muharram narratives actually engage with conceptual and theoretical ideas related to the medieval Qutub Shahi dynasty. And then again, late 19th century, of course, in global history of Islam and Sufism, we know this. This was like a period of Islamic and Sufi revivalism, but we don't know much about what is happening in vernacular context, how Islamic revivalism is really influencing or inspiring vernacular discourses on Sufism. But the most important thing, last but not the least, is the location of various Sufi shrines. And how Sufi shrines, they are not just about Sufism or local Muslim practices, they are more about uh, uh, like global Islamic practices as well. And then Muharram, of course, is crucial in the making of this kind of vernacular Sufism. So there is no separation between like global Islamic practices and then vernacular Sufi practices in this case. So that is actually one of the arguments I am going to make. Since this talk is more about literary practices, I want to begin with a folk poem that I documented during my field research on Muharram narratives around 2006 and 2010. I was about to wrap up my field research, and then I got a surprise invitation from a cultural team of a village. They asked me to visit and watch the Muharram performance. Then I realized it was the month of Ramzan, just like this. When I said, "Oh no, it is not the month of Muharram. Why are you performing this storytelling session now, particularly in the month of Ramadan?" And then the team member responded, it's not about Ramzan or Muharram. Every Thursday and Friday is our Ramzan or Muharram. Don't miss our performance, please do visit. With no big expectations, I traveled all the way to this village and stayed there the entire night, documenting the performance. It was an oral poem. It's like it ran into like 15 to 20 pages in my translation, but it's quite a long narrative. At the end of the performance, towards the end of the performance, another female performer, Saida B, that is Hindu basically, but she got Sayed name, and then Saidamma in Telugu, Saida plus Amma, added something totally new piece that I felt immediately it's an addition, not the part of the long narrative. See, this is very interesting aspect. So the storytelling session is quite amazing and fascinating because when the performers enter into the storytelling session, they enter with their own stanzas. So they challenge that already traditionally available narrative and then they include their own details. So there is some certain autobiographical element as well within in this long narrative. So the song, this is the song I documented. The God I worship every day is a God of Turks. The God I visit every Thursday is a God of Dargah. The God I worship every day is the one with a niyatu. Niyatu is a Teluguized word for niyat, niya, pure intention. The God I visit every Thursday is a God of Barkatu. So Barkat is a Teluguized term Barkatu. This God I worship is the Peer of all peers. So this kind of these expressions during the conversation, when I asked the narrator about the beginnings of this song, she said, "Not sure. I heard this from my ancestors, and they might have heard this from their ancestors too." So the periodization is quite difficult here. Not sure when exactly when it was exactly made, when it was produced, and when it was circulated. So, of course, that is the nature of folk poem, right? Several years later, I returned to the field just to document Sufi shrine narratives. And then I had an opportunity to document different versions of the same poem. I noticed that each version was made changes as it fits into your local shrine's history and ritual culture. Since then, I have developed a curiosity in the various ways these songs use Telugu and Urdu language terms, even long Urdu sentences very often. As I continue to document more oral poems, I also noticed that this is not something about using a specific language. They made this deliberate choice to stress various concepts and themes that each of these local shrines represent. In the above poem, the usage of the terms such as niyat, barkat, and pir, in fact, transgress the boundaries of a language and enter the core of a vernacular discourse of Sufism. Historian Niall Green, in his study on various Sufi written practices in the Hyderabad princely state, emphasized how a model was created by the official political relationships between Hindus and Muslims. Following this model, made available by the Hindu minister of the Hyderabad, Maharaja Kishan Prasad, shows how, quote begins, his greatest innovation to give religious shape to this political relationship between Hindu subjects and then Muslim rulers, quote ends. Contesting this idea of political relationship between Hindu subjects and Muslim rulers, my work brings evidence from various Sufi writings from the British India and their relevance in creating a pluralist culture in the coastal Andhra. In this context, the political authority that was being utilized in the Hyderabad princely state becomes an extremely remote historical aspect. Various local Sufi masters and poets control the spiritual realm by influencing both Hindu and Muslim disciples at various levels. Nevertheless, as we can see, from these observations, understand from these observations, there has been a consistent participation and performance of diverse caste groups of Hindu devotees within this distinctive realm. My larger project focuses on three waves of Sufi literary cultures in this region. So that was the early phase of Persian influence on Telugu, starts around 1500, and then I would say 1900 ends in 1900. And the second wave starts at 1900 and then ends at 1945. And then third wave comes again after this rise of Hindu nationalism in 1992. But today's talk is about the second wave of Sufism. And then this presentation has two sections. The first section deals with the early print culture and the production of Sufi writings, and the second section about how such Sufi literary production was circulated among both Hindu and Muslim communities, with an emphasis on the role of Hindu Sufi followers in spreading the message. The above oral poem speaks more about a devotional sphere that uses the benefits of a multilingual and pluralist socio-cultural setting. Such a creative process also involves a shift from orality to written, although a continuum of oral narrative strategies through these written pieces is also clearly visible. Before I get into another key dimension of this presentation, Hindu-Muslim interactions, I need to speak a little bit about how this multilingual location produced a wide variety of Sufi writings even during the earliest phase of the print and literary cultures in Telugu. In 1911, publication of the Telugu translation of Jogendra Singh's work, Nur Jahan, the publisher said, of a glance through the pages of the quarterly, this is a quote, A glance through the pages of the quarterly reports of the Registrar of Books will show how rich is the literary output in two of the South Indian vernaculars, namely Tamil and Telugu. Of all the South Indian vernaculars, these two languages show a vigorous and lively growth despite many discouragements they suffer. So this is the title of the book published in 1911, Nur Jahan. It's translated by one Hindu, Balantrapu Venkata Subbarao. So the preface also mentions another key dimension by saying a good vernacular reading public is also becoming a fact. So within this robust production of vernacular writings in Telugu, we can also see a rich heritage of Sufi writings, which were not acknowledged in the mainstream historiography of Telugu even now. During my recent archival research at the British Library and a few private libraries in the two Telugu-speaking states, I have obtained more than 100 Sufi literary texts published between 1890 to 1920. Many of these texts fall under three categories. So one is like revisiting the Muslim past, and then Islamic folk narratives, and then finally Sufi writings. But in the early days, like of course, I am also going to talk about like 1890 as a landmark in the production and circulation of Sufi writings in Telugu. But around 1900, we see lot of prose narratives published as chapbooks, and then very popular editions that run into like 25 to 30 pages, easily available in market. That is where the when they're talking about the creation of a new reading public. So that is like a very broader term that involves both, includes both Hindus and Muslims, Christians as well, who were actually consuming these texts and then circulating these texts among them as groups. So among these writings that I have gathered until now, the earliest Sufi text was from 1890, namely Paratatva Kirtanalu in Telugu, means the spiritual hymns. To explain this process between 1890 to 1930, I will analyze two prominent dimensions. How the ways these poets and storytellers were using both Islamic and Hindu literary practices, and the second, various approaches of the reading public, consisting of both audiences and their reading strategies. So here you see like the cover page of a journal, Andhra Bharati, like which was one of the earliest journals in Telugu, but which also published a lot of materials on Sufism. Most importantly, various small towns in the coastal Andhra became the prominent centers of such literary production that resulted in the expansion of Sufi culture even to a diverse class of people. However, many of them were still from middle class families. So this class actually plays a big role in the making of this Sufi public culture. Considering such location as a key factor in the making of the culture, I would use the term, I would use the alternative term, small town Sufism. During these 4 decades between 1890 to 1930, these small towns established their own printing presses, reading groups, and debating clubs to discuss this mode of vernacular Sufism. This journal actually published from Machilipatnam, and then there are other presses that I'm going to mention. There are also very small towns like Tanuku, Pithapuram, Rajahmundry. So they are nothing to do with what was happening in Hyderabad princely state at that point. So that's the reason why I'm like, it's not just a political relationship, it's more than that. Whereas the mainstream scholarship in the history of Telugu literature totally undermines the impact of such uh, Sufi or popular Islamic practices, we have sufficient sources in the everyday life of these ordinary people. Their songs, which we call as a version of oral poems, introduce us to a variety of Sufi narrative practices, including the prophetic praise songs, gender narratives of the Prophet's female family, particularly Fatima, Sakina, and Zainab, and most importantly, the place histories of various Sufi shrines. To begin with, we will land in 1890 and go to a small town called Pithapuram, which in coastal Andhra. Pithapuram in the East Godavari district is on the banks of the river Godavari and known as one of the 18 Mahashakti Pithas prominent in Shakteya Hinduism. Pithapuram is also known as Dakshina Kasi according to the family history of the Shah school of Sufism, which was like it is even now the center of this, Pithapuram is the center of this Shah school of Sufism. The entry of their ancestors in the late 15th century made this small town a center for Sufism. However, we see a distinctive version of Sufism that started engaging with the classics of Hinduism, even during the times of early modernity. In 1890, the Saint Muhyiddin Badshah was busy traveling even the remotest villages of this region, spreading the message of Sufism. Since he was addressing a majority section of the non-Muslims, including Hindus and then different caste groups, he adopted an approach that appeals to them. So he actually started using kirtana, raga-based kirtanas, and then uh, added Sufi messages into their structure. According to Shah family's history, it is said that the Sufi organization named Sri Vijnana Vidya Adhyatmika Peetham, roughly translated as the Center for Global Knowledge, Education and Spiritualism, was established in 1472. Later, the school moved to Delhi with enormous support from the Mughal Empire. Subsequently, Madin Kabir Shah, the leader of this organization, expanded the activities further into the Deccan and the domain of the Golconda dynasty. During this period, the congregation received a land gift of two villages, Jagirs, in the present-day town of Tuni in the East Godavari district. With the support, Madin Kabir Shah developed various institutions of Sufism, garnering the support of local devotees, including Hindus and Muslims alike. Shah's school of Sufism highlights the Qadriya order, emphasizing the ways that knowledge of spirituality should blend with everyday life. Founded by Abdul Qadir Jilani, the Qadriya school has been a popular order since South Asian Sufism's formative period in 12th century. Many practices related to the Qadriya school of Sufism find expression in the ritual and material cultures of the Telugu-speaking states in South India. Nevertheless, the Shah school's approach represents a particular concern with the sources of knowledge or jnana. Such a hybridity of Sufism and Hindu mysticism becomes prominent in the works of Umar Ali Shah between 1910 and 1930s. Shah was certainly engaging with notions of jnana, developed central to Hindu mystical and philosophical traditions associated. This should not obscure the ways that he develops the concept within a local Islamic sphere. We introduce a few segments from this poetry and then discuss how this translation works in local Sufism, articulated through literary Telugu. So this is like a poem written by him. The way of devotion appears as the most esteemed dharmic path, kindled into being by the knowledge assembly. As the worldly temples and deities driving the visible world perish and fall through knowledge of the truth of the Lord, mental power becomes noble greatness. So this is Umar Ali Shah writing around 1930s. How could jnana be expressed through the way of devotion? To propagate this mode of spirituality, Umar Ali Shah concentrated on the theme of knowledge. As a key resource, he drew from the South Indian bhakti culture. In such a situation that crosses the boundaries of a practical dimension of worship, what do devotees learn? In this poem, Umar Ali Shah connects two prominent themes, dharma and jnana, which were both reinterpreted in a locally produced Sufi idiom. The distinctive aspect of Hindu-Muslim hybridity remains central to the entire ethos of the Shah school of Sufism and is readily apparent in their literary output. Umar Ali Shah's father, Muhyiddin Badshah, composed these raga-based kirtanas to reach his Hindu followers, whereas most of his ancestors, including his father, directed their efforts toward producing a spiritual culture. Shah ranged further to engage with decidedly political questions of modernity, nationalism, freedom movement, thereby expanding the intervention of Sufism into his contemporary political and public culture. That way, that becomes a political aspect. So, in this regard, he followed his father and other Sufi masters that preceded him. We can see that Umar Ali Shah forges a new path in the realm of literary form. During the early phase of his literary production, he followed his father Muhyiddin Badshah insofar as he composed devotional hymns or kirtanas, which were a popular vehicle of devotionalism in South India, particularly in Telugu. But later phases, Umar Ali Shah moved away from the kirtana and began to conceive his spiritual ideology through the forms of neoclassical Telugu literature. His participation in modern Telugu literature's so-called neoclassical turn marks the way that he more broadly engaged with the forms and styles of Telugu literary modernity. So here I am going to give an example of Muhyiddin Badshah's Kirtana. Listen up. I have something extraordinary to say indeed. Right in this body is Brahma. Look for yourself and see. Birth sets in, but a soul no succor. How is given to no one ever? What has been made and what is the source? I don't know, but I keep to yoga's course. Listen up. I have something extraordinary to say indeed. Right in this body is Brahma. Look for yourself and see. Departing from this idea of Tattva, Tattvalu is a very popular genre, bhakti genre in Telugu. So this also falls under that category. Like and then Kirtana hymns. Shah then entered into a modern realm of poetic practice by embracing a poetic form much closer to his contemporaries in the Telugu literary sphere. So this is what Umar Ali Shah was doing between 1900 and the 1930s. He was engaging with modernity. He was participating in the nationalist discourse. And then he was also was in conversation with global Islam and then traveled extensively teaching this in-between spaces between global Islam and then vernacular Islam. But his focus was more about how Sufism could be utilized as a meeting point for both bhakti and then ibadat. Following Umar Ali Shah's school of Sufism, several non-Muslim poets too started writing about Sufi themes, thus exploring deeper meanings of the mystical dimension of Islam. So these creative works functioned more as critical interventions in Telugu literary culture, and a new Sufi public emerged between the key decades of 1920s and 1940s. During this next wave of Sufi poetics, we find both mostly non-Muslim poets writing Sufi texts in Telugu. So this is the translation of Umar Khayyam's Riwayat in Telugu, done by one non-Muslim Hindu called Duvuri Ramireddy, who was trained in Persian language and literature, and then translated Rubaiyat directly from Farsi to Telugu. So while Umar Ali Shah represents a family legacy of Sufism and Islam-centric approach, Ramireddy's work offers a distinctively diverse approach. Despite his non-Muslim identity and traditional literary background, Duvuri Ramireddy turned to Sufism and its literature to find a path to personal trauma. However, this personal takes on more a public manifestation as his poetry helped to create a larger reading public. Even now, uh, people recite poems from this Telugu translation of Rubaiyat. Tuguri's efforts spread the foundational aspects of Sufism among the non-Muslim public in Telugu. Although there have been more than 20 translations of the Rubaiyat available in Telugu, almost more than 20, I think. I'm actually working on a separate chapter on how Rubaiyat becomes a Sufi tool in the making of Telugu vernacular Islam and Sufism. Tuvuri's translation stands out for so many reasons. He made the recital of a Rubaiyat as an enjoyable activity among the new educated middle class of his times. In a way, he opened up the doors of Sufism for a secular reading public and thus cultivated a taste for Persian poetry. In an elaborate introduction to his translation of the Rubaiyat, Duvuri Ramireddy provides for his readers some background and brief comparison between Arab-centered Islam and then Persian-centered Islam. Here, Duvuri Ramireddy offers the difference between Sanskrit and Telugu literary history as an analogy, where Telugu literary practices are seen more open and flexible, like those of Persian. And then he compares Arabic with Sanskrit literary culture, which is like, for him, it is like a closed culture. So he clearly defines this open and closed cultural aspects in the preface. Even now, Ramireddy continues to be appreciated for his non-Sanskritic diction and expressions in his verses. So that is where vernacular plays a huge role in the making of Telugu Sufi translations from Farsi. He also encouraged rereading the Telugu classics through the lens of Farsi poetry and poetics. In an essay about the 15th century poet Allasani Peddana, he compares the thought process of its lead character, Varudhini, with those of Umar Khayyam. At one point, Dubur Ramireddy said, quote, Varudhini was in many ways a disciple of Umar Khayyam. She asks the same questions as Umar Khayyam did. Quote ends. And then Duri responds again. Umar Khayyam and Varudhini share similar questions and concerns when Varudhini asks, when you perform austerity for the pleasures of heaven, why are such pleasures forbidden on the earth? In this way, Rami Reddy's journey with the Persian aesthetics and Sufism have generated an exemplary model for rethinking both classical and modern literary texts. During the same period, another poet with Dalit background, Gurram Joshua, began experimenting with poems related to historical figures of Sufism. However, his treatment of history emphasizes a more popular version of history telling. As explained in the previous section, Joshua highlights the story of Firdausi as a Sufi thinker and introduces him to the Telugu audience. So this revisiting this Muslim past is also crucial in this second wave of Sufism in Telugu. Nevertheless, unlike Umar Ali Shah and Rami Reddy, who were directly in dialogue with Sufism, Joshua presents a dimension which we can call Persianate or Islamicate. With no knowledge of Persian or Islamic literatures, Joshua uses materials from oral stories and views a new story that resembles some version of history, but takes several detours from the recorded history. So what we can call, so this is whatever Gurram Joshua speaks is a more like his perception of history rather than the recorded history. So he kind of documents his feelings, his impressions about Ferdowsi and the Muslim history, and then describes all the Muslim contexts as if they happened in the land of Telugu. So this is another like aspect of vernacular Sufism where the geography and then historical narrative blend. By noticing these changes in the early phase of a vernacular Sufi discourse, we can understand how multiple strands of thought gradually traveled towards a version of literary Sufism. Several thematic and structural innovations made by these poets and writers produced a repertoire of literary Sufism consisting of classical and contemporary, Islamic and Islamicate, Persian and Persianate in the Telugu public sphere. So the distinctions between classical, contemporary, Islamic, Islamicate, and then Persian and Persianate, they are clearly configured in the writings of these early poets who were writing about Sufism in Telugu. But most of these poets, they were influenced by Farsi literary aesthetics. And then they were actually learning Farsi to engage with these Sufi texts, original texts. But when they were producing a text in Telugu, they were actually coming up with an innovative theme and then innovative structure. So that is just nothing to do with whatever like happening in the Farsi text. So this text, Telugu text is totally different from its original. We cannot say there is something original, but in Farsi, this is like totally a Telugu text, deeply grounded in the everyday pluralism in this region. So before I think, Ankurji, do you have time?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, you can take 5 more minutes, even 10 more minutes. It's fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what happened between 1900 and 1920 was so Umar Ali Shah actually wrote this great classic, but it's not considered as classic in mainstream history. But for me, as a scholar of Sufi studies, student of Sufi studies, I believe it is a classic. So it is called Sufi Vedanta Darsamu. So you can clearly see what he is doing in the title itself. Like you have this Sufi, and then this you have this Vedantic discourse, and then he was actually blending them. But most of the poems in this text, this is like 120 pages text. So I'm going to have a detailed chapter in my book about this specific text. So it's more about how he wanted to bring Qadriya Sufism into this local context. And then he translates all Qadriya concepts into this vernacular um, language and then introduces each concept with a philosophical kind of understanding. So he wanted to produce a philosophical text rather than a literary text in that way. So he also, in the process, connects global Sufi orders. And then he wants to speak about how those global Sufi orders are in dialogue with vernacular orders. And then, but finally, he emphasizes the value of vernacular Sufism. And then, as I noticed in my previous work on Muharram, like in Festival of Peace, there is always this conversation between local and then universal, particularly in the context of Islam and then Sufism. Even non-Muslim poets and writers, they were very much clear about those connections. Most of the non-Muslim poets whom I mentioned in this talk, and then there are so many other people like also who performed over Khayyam and other texts in Telugu, they all realize that there is a constant dialogue between local Islam and universal Islam. And then in the case of poets such as Umar Ali Shah, because he was also a part of political system at that point, he was actually using Sufism as a modern tool to generate Muslim political discourse. So these are like so many like aspects that I actually wanted to discuss. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that kind of analysis in my next work. And then since I began this presentation today with a oral poem, long oral poem, I want to end the presentation with one segment from the same oral poem. So this is also very interesting segment where you can clearly see how where these oral singers, folklore singers are connecting Islam and Hinduism. So salam to Ali. Ali is my Ramaya, Rama. Salam to Fatima, Fatima. Fatima is my Sitama. Salam to Hussein and Hussein. Hussein and Hussein are our playmates. We sing for them, we dance for them, we worship them to the end of this world. Salam to Ali. Ali is my Ramaya. Salam to Fatima. Fatima is my Sitama. Thank you so much.